A new and consequential document has just been released by the Trump administration, the National Security Strategy of the United States. This 33-page strategy is essentially the administration's formal blueprint for how it views the world and where American priorities should shift. It influences budgets, military planning, and long-term foreign policy decisions. What makes this addition interesting is how sharply it reorients US focus, not towards the Middle East or Europe, but towards the Western Hemisphere itself. One of the most striking themes is the emphasis on keeping the larger US presence in Western Hemisphere. The logic, according to the strategy, is straightforward. Migration pressure, drug trafficking, and the efforts of adversarial powers are increasingly shaping the region. The document puts it bluntly. Border security is the primary element of national security. That framing turns the Western Hemisphere into something almost synonymous with homeland protection. There is even a new phrase introduced, what the strategy calls the Trump corollary or the Monroe Doctrine. That's a reference to the 1823 principle warning outside powers not to interfere in the hemisphere. Here, it's updated to argue that any US aid or alliance should depend on limiting adversarial influence in things like ports, infrastructure, and strategic assets. It's an unusually hemispheric first worldview, and it's a major shift from past strategies that spread attention more evenly across the global regions. Now, the section on Europe is pointed. The strategy suggests Europe is facing a kind of civilizational decline, linking that to the idea of migration patterns and social liberalism. At the same time, Washington calls on Europe governments to assume much greater responsibility, including spending 5% of GDP on NATO defense, a figure far more than current levels. But here is where this strategy gets complicated. By mixing moral criticism with high expectations, the document risks reinforcing a perception in European capitals that the US sees Europe less as a partner and more as a dependent. That tension has been growing for years, and this framing does not soften it. In the Middle East, the US goal remains familiar: prevent any single power from dominating the region and protect key maritime choke points. What stands out, though, is the limited attention the region receives compared to the previous strategies. Africa receives even less focus, mentioned mostly in passing. Another clear pillar is the emphasis on US energy dominance, especially through oil, gas, coal, and nuclear. The document explicitly rejects net zero climate agendas, framing them as incompatible with national security objectives. As you would expect, Asia and especially China occupies a major portion of the strategy. But the tone is more calibrated than the headlines might suggest. The administration says it wants to rebalance America's economic relationship with China, focusing on reciprocity and fairness and restoring US economic independence. At the same time, the document says trade should remain mutually beneficial and focused on non-sensitive factors. That is a careful balancing act between confrontation and cautious engagement. On Taiwan, the strategy emphasizes continuity. The US does not support unilateral changes to the status quo in the Taiwan Strait. There is also a quick nod to India's role in Quad and in tech cooperation. While Afghanistan is not mentioned and Pakistan appears only briefly in relation to the past India-Pakistan tensions. Something viewers often notice in documents like this is what gets downplayed. In this case, topics like climate change, pandemics, financial instability, and certain cyber threats are framed more ideologically than strategically. Yet, we know these issues directly affect supply chains, public health, and global stability. There's also a broader critique on the strategy. The document repeatedly frames prior policies in sweeping, ideological terms, crediting a single administration and making objectivity harder for partners or even for domestic audiences to fully accept. Now you might be wondering, how closely will President Trump actually follow this strategy? Historically, presidents of both parties, from George W. Bush to Joe Biden, have shifted course while global events forced their hand. And Trump, being more unpredictable by nature, may or may not stick with these principles over time. The strategy sets the direction, but reality often rewrites the map. So what's the landscape? A Western Hemisphere first strategy, sharper demands on Europe, a restrained but firm posture towards China, and noticeably smaller spotlight on the Middle East and Africa. Whether you agree with these choices or not, understanding them is essential because they shape how the US engages with the world and how the world responds in return.